My mother was a pioneer and a trailblazer in the legal profession. She was the first woman silk, jointly with Helena Normanton. She was the first woman judge, second woman High Court judge, and a string of firsts she had, because no woman had done what she had done before. My mother was very beautiful, very attractive, and in that sense, she was slightly unusual because it was often expected that women who went into careers was something of a blue stocking. She gave an interview when she was, I think, before she was called to the bar at a time when she could, which the headline is, "I'm no blue stocking," in which she tried to explain that she enjoyed dancing and clothes and all the rest of it, which she always did. My mother qualified as a barrister, but before she was called to the bar, her mother, to whom she was very close, died from breast cancer, age 49. And that was the only time, I think, in her career she ever considered giving it up. She was very shocked by that because she was only 24 and very close, as I said, to her mother. But she pulled herself together, and she then was called to the bar in 1939. And then she had to find a pupillage, and that was the first difficulty, because her lecturer or dean at Liverpool University, who I think had been very pro my mother, but she tried to get into his chambers, and I have the letter where it said that it wasn't thought that the men would like to have a woman in chambers, or words to that effect. So I think it was quite difficult, her finding pupillage. She eventually found pupillage, and with someone called Dick Trotter, who later became a circuit judge. And from then on, I think she didn't look back. She was a novelty from the start. So whenever she appeared in, whether it was Penrith Magistrates Court or whatever, there would be a tiny article in the newspaper, "First woman to appear in these magistrates' courts." And then, because she was pretty unique, she would get other little snippets in the newspaper, remembering, of course, that she herself could not talk to the newspapers because it was professional misconduct to give an interview. But she did her work well, and she had some successes along the way, and she built up a practice. She often said to me that people used to say, well, one of the reasons she built up her practice was because the men were away at the war. This was the Second World War. But her retort was also, well, that may be something that helped, but unlike a lot of the other women on the circuit, and she was a member of the Northern Circuit, she kept her practice after the men came back. So I think she was particularly good at what she did, and it was always said that when she addressed a jury, juries hung on her every word, and particularly as she got more famous, people would queue to listen to her addressing juries. And of course by 1967 it all changed when the death penalty went. One of the reasons that there was such publicity for all these cases, particularly murder cases, was that if people were found guilty, they were hanged. And that attracted a lot of attention. And people used to go to court to watch the spectacle. I think a lot of people underestimated her legal ability because the publicity she got and what she was known for was her success in criminal cases, particularly murder cases. But actually she did an awful lot of very important cases in the House of Lords. For example, she appeared in a case in the House of Lords which led to the Crown Proceedings Act. Before that, people couldn't sue the Crown if they'd been injured. So that was a huge success, and that led to a piece of legislation which has benefited society down the years. This is a photograph of my mother. It's a formal photograph when she took silk. But unlike the photographs of the men, even with a rather unattractive long wig, you can still see what a beautiful woman she was when she was much younger, and she was this time 34. Well, this photograph was taken in 1953 when I was on holiday with my mother and father. And you can see my father in the background, and I seem to be holding an ice cream. I was quite a little tot in those days. But it indicates that I had a pretty normal childhood, and we went abroad for a couple of weeks, and I assume had a lovely holiday. I was loved. I was an only child. A lot of people nowadays talk about, you know, the deprivations of children having working parents, but I knew nothing different. I didn't feel I was deprived of anything. I didn't go to boarding school, so I probably saw more of my mother and father than I would have done had I done so. My mother in those days was always there at weekends, always there in school holidays, because the law terms had long holidays. My father had a general practice as a doctor in Liverpool and would come home at lunchtime and was home every evening and at weekends. So I didn't really feel that I was any different from any other child. I don't think my mother was ever a career woman or a blue stocking. I mean, she enjoyed male company throughout her career, and she had, from what I researched, lots of boyfriends over the years, but she never found the one until she met my father. It was a very happy marriage between my parents. They were different in many ways. My mother was probably the more ambitious. She was the more modern. Dad was perhaps slightly Victorian, not though in his attitude to women, but in some other things. He had a wicked sense of humour and would always keep us laughing. And I think he kept her feet on the ground because they moved in his circles socially, which was very different from the legal circles, although they obviously socialised with legal people as well. My mother was a fun-loving person. She had a terrifically infectious laugh, which I always remember to this day. And if she started, it would be painful laughing. She had huge energy because she did an enormous amount. She'd finish a case and she'd take a train somewhere and then go and give a lecture. She ran a house, she had a daughter, she had a husband, and she was, I suppose, determined. She had a lot of common sense. She tried to balance her life as best she could, and I think she was able to do it because she had two names effectively. She was Rose Heilbron, the professional, and then she was Mrs. Burstein, the wife and mother. And she had long holidays. She had time off then. She would have some time off at the weekends. They would work. I do remember when I was in my teens that she would often work of an evening, and when she had a final speech to do, she would be working up till 4 in the morning with plates of soup to keep her going. So I remember her as being very hard-working. She was very loving and a dynamic personality, I suppose. Once my mother had established herself as a silk, it would then have normally been expected within a few years that she would have become a recorder, which is a part-time judge. And in those days, you'd be assigned to what was called quarter sessions in a particular town. Well, being a woman, it took much longer, and she had to wait much longer. But eventually, in 1956, she was made Recorder of Burnley. And she was the first woman who had ever been made a professional judge, albeit that it was part-time. And it created huge publicity. With headlines, first woman judge, because for 800 years of the judiciary, there had never been a woman before. But that was a very big stepping stone on the judicial path, or the legal path, for women. I think Mum was obviously very excited about it and very proud of that. And in later years, of course, she became a High Court judge. But at the time, that was very much a huge thing. My mother clearly suffered prejudice. On circuit, they have something called bar mess, which every term, the legal term, all the barristers get together for a jolly evening of drinks and chat. But women were not allowed into bar mess. So when she finished a case, her chums would go off, get changed and have a drink and go off to bar mess. If she was on circuit away from home, she would go back to her hotel and have dinner on her own. And of course, even later, and I think it was only when she became leader of the Northern Circuit, was she allowed into something called Grand Court, which is, I think, a less regular dinner on the basis that they would be telling naughty stories, and that wouldn't be suitable for a woman, given that she had seen life at the raw end in her career. That was somewhat surprising. One of the things that did irritate my mother was that there's a degree of patience, and she had to wait a long time for every stage of her career. I think particularly being a High Court judge, she had to wait until she was 60 before she was made a High Court judge, whereas she should have expected it with her practice 5 years earlier. And whether or not that would have enabled her to go higher up the judicial ranking, I don't know. She never made it to the Court of Appeal. I never knew why. But there were people who said she should have done. I think one of the regrets I always have had, or I now have, is particularly writing her biography, is in not discussing a lot of these things with her. She always knew that her life was something different, and she kept all her contemporaneous memorabilia and documents, which enabled me to write the biography. She herself turned down many opportunities to do so, but she knew eventually it would be done. So I had a lot of the source material, but the one source I didn't have was talking to her. I was able to talk to my father, who outlived her, but I couldn't talk to her, and I regret that.